right, thank you all. Welcome to our next panel on the contemporary problems to which gratitude is an antidote. I think I'm the one who's at fault for that strange turn of phrase, but I think it describes well some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So our panelists, Rachel Bulman of Word on Fire and the author of her recently published book, Becoming Wife, and Brandon Dahm, who is a philosophy professor here at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and Mark Spencer, a philosophy professor at University of St. Thomas, Minnesota, and an academic advisor for the Hildebrand Project. So we will start with Rachel.
Can you start with Rachel? There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in this panel, we're going to talk about the human challenges to which gratitude is an antidote. And I'm going to speak about it in a more specific instance. Brandon is going to speak about it from a more general instance with the Chedia, and then you're going to hear from Mark speak about it from an even more general and more broad sense with nihilism. And so I want to speak to you today about the tools that we use currently for community, primarily technology. Now, let me preface this by the fact that I am not speaking about this from a foreign place. I am very present in a lot of technological spheres. I work in the Word on Fire Institute and their online platform. And so I am a friend of technology. I'm not saying that technology is innately bad. So I just want to lay that out there before I dive into the things that I think it blocks for us to be able to practice gratitude and be able to practice it authentically. And so when persons are separated by technology, it lacks an incarnational reality. For those that are joining us virtually, it is a convenience and a blessing, but it doesn't negate your desire to be materially in this room with us. So it would seem that a lot of the community and the communication that we have through technology presents to us in isolation. So sending a text message lacks the immediacy and intimacy of having a conversation. I can edit my text message. I actually found that out yesterday. Did you guys know that? That you can edit the text message you've already sent? I can take time to think about the way that I'm speaking. I can change the way that I'm wording things, and the reader actually gets to determine my tone based on their experiences that they've had with me in the past in person. And so live discussion and dialogue has an immediacy and an intimacy which was required for true conversation. Now on social media, I can tailor content. I can filter photos, and I can bring Gandhi and Rousseau into captions beneath pictures of Legos and dishwashers. A snippet of my reality, often doctored and overanalyzed, makes the viewer feel as if they know me, as if they see me when they see just a moment of my reality beneath filters and carefully chosen words. It might be one of the strangest conversations that I often have right now with our family is featured on Meet the Bulmans on the Word on Fire Institute YouTube channel. And I'll be at a conference, someone will walk up to me and they'll say, "Man, I just love your family." I'm like, "Me too." So it's a really strange thing that social media presents to us in that way. And so the use of technology creates a sort of isolation that harms true communion. It tempts persons into a type of ontological anxiety. There's no longer a sense of givenness, but now there is a sense of self-creation. I no longer want to receive who I am, but instead I have to make myself. There must be an ontological space to become oneself. This is intrinsic to the gift of creation. When we receive our givenness, we are able to participate in a sort of unveiling of the person. There is an ontological obedience to one another. But when technology is used as a literal filter of our personhood, of our givenness, the person is no longer participating with that gift. Instead, the gift is manipulated. There is no longer space to wonder at the fact of their givenness. The human person sees the truth of becoming, but ignores the contemplation of it, and instead erodes their givenness with a focus on making. Without givenness and without acceptance of your person, there is a lack of gratitude. Technology in and of itself, as I said before, is not bad, but it does tempt the human person to deny their givenness, even to a point of altering their complete existence. That's where we get things like catfishing or avatar profile pictures because you don't want anyone to see your face, or completely false identities. So how do we combat this? We must practice person-to-person communication. Meeting in person, real-life conversations and events are the preference, but if technology must be used, may it be used in its realist sense. We can make phone calls instead of send text messages. FaceTime a friend instead of make a phone call. When we are able to engage in true person-to-person dialogue, in addition to the intimacy and the immediacy previously mentioned, there is actually a vulnerability. There's a transparency that demands reverence in true person-to-person dialogue. Sitting across from a friend, a loved one, or a colleague and telling them your thoughts and listening to theirs is an act of gratitude. Listening to someone speak, seeing the expressions in their face, noting their body language of apprehension or excitement, truly listening to one another and seeing one another is an act of gratitude. And I don't think it's wrong to say that currently in our society, the ability to engage in civil and fruitful dialogue, especially when our beliefs are in opposition, is because we have an inability to be grateful. There's an inability and a lack of gratitude that we practice for humanity and all of its facets and differences and all of its shapes and forms. And so I'm reminded of St. John Vianney in closing, who is asked why he sits before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration. And he responded, "He looks at me and I look at him." This is a reverence of ontological space, and in many ways an affirmation of the other. It is good that you exist is the thread that we keep hearing this week. And so that thought is something that is diminished when technology becomes the medium of seeing and being seen. Communication is a convenience, but communion is the desire. Thank you.
Hello. Is mine working now? Good. Can you all hear me? All right. Thank you for having me. I'm going to try and do a little analytic philosophy and hope to not embody any recently mentioned criticisms. And one of my students is here. I teach a course on the Deadly Vices tradition. One of my students says she has heard Acadia mentioned or pronounced in 5 different ways so far. And so I'm going to say Acadia, and I'm going to say it confidently. Without any confidence, it's actually the way. But that's how I will pronounce it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how gratitude helps correct Acadia. There is a handout floating around. This is my handout. So I have some background theses. I'm not really...
This is...
Oh,
okay.
If anyone's sitting near someone can pass back to share.
An extra one, too.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with the background theses. I'll explain these briefly, but I won't defend them at all, really. So here's the first one. Virtues and vices are emotion-generating dispositions. Another way of saying that is virtuous and vicious people are given to experience the world in certain patterned ways. They're more likely to experience a certain range of emotions given certain situations. The next thesis, background thesis, is that virtues and vices affect sight. This is similar. These emotions that we feel, because we have a virtue or a vice or something approaching a virtue or a vice, affects how we experience the world. What stands out to the cruel person when they see someone suffering, how they experience that, how they see that is different than the kind person, the charitable person. They see the thing differently. And then the third, this is an account of emotions from one of my professors, Bob Roberts. He thinks that emotions are concern-based construals. I'm not worried about that being the whole story about emotions, but I think it's an insightful way of understanding them. So let's take construals first. So these are quasi-perceptual ways of seeing the world. So here's an example. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. Everyone understood that sentence? Mark did. He went to Buffalo. Okay. So buffalo can mean a few things. It can mean the large animal that you should not pet. It can mean a place where some people do their PhDs. And it can also be a verb which means to intimidate. So if you have 2 buffalo from Buffalo and they intimidate 2 other buffalo from Buffalo, you have the sentence, buffalo, 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 buffalo. Now it's a meaningful sentence now, I hope. You'll use it often, you'll be surprised. But what happens now when you see it is instead of seeing it as just a repeated word 5 times, hopefully you see it as a meaningful sentence. Your experience of this is different. You construe it differently based on this different information. The duck rabbit's also maybe a familiar example that's just below it. You can see it as a duck. You can see it as a rabbit. It's the same set of lines. So these are construals. Emotions, Robert thinks, are construals that arise from some love, some hatred, some deep commitment, some care we have. So they're concern-based construals. So let me give you an example of how these operate. So imagine you live in Steubenville like me, and you get invited over to a very important person's house, like John Crosby. And you're sitting at dinner with your children, and you're eating, and all of a sudden there's a crash from the other room. And you realize your youngest, my youngest, maybe she's not yours, Lucy is missing. And we walk into the room, and John's favorite possession, a vase that he inherited from his great-great-grandmother, is now shattered on the ground around Lucy. And my wife and I are there, and John is there, and we react very differently. My wife, being a loving mother, her concern is for the safety of her child, and so she has fear. She sees this as dangerous. Her concern of love gives rise to this way of seeing the world. I'm shallower than her, and I'm concerned about my reputation. And I'm with a very important person. And so I feel embarrassment. I see this as embarrassing. Lucy has embarrassed me. And John, if you know John, you know about his anger problem. He's very, very mad. And he sees this as an offense to him. So these are emotions according to Roberts, these different ways of experiencing it that arise from the things we care about. I think this is a really fruitful account of emotion. I won't defend it, but I'll just leave that there. So the last background thesis is that virtues and vices need their characteristic activities for development. This is a standard account of virtue formation. You grow in virtue or vice by doing the acts of those virtues or vices. But they also need them for their maintenance. What keeps a virtue or vice alive is their activities. The virtues and vices give rise to their activities, but those activities also reinforce those dispositions, those habits. So one way I like to think about virtue formation, and hope to have some, is through a kind of starvation model, where what we do to get rid of a vice is starve it out. We don't give it the things it needs to stay alive. And so we keep it from its activities. And if virtue and vices are emotion-generating dispositions, one of the activities that it needs is its way of seeing the world, its way of construing the world. The angry person sees the world as a series of offenses. And if we can stop seeing things as so offensive, stop being annoyed at everything the person does around us, the person who goes over their time so you don't have as much time, which is the offense I'm worried about giving to Mark, the anger is starved. It doesn't have what it needs to stay alive, and it gets diminished. Aquinas talks about this as a kind of moral erosion. If a habit isn't used, it starts to fall apart. So what I want to give is a model where we talk about Acadia and its characteristic emotion, its characteristic way of seeing the world, and then talk about gratitude as something that sees the world incompatibly with Acadia, and if we can cultivate gratitude, we can starve out Acadia. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go through it pretty fast here. So a little background on Acadia. So if you're reading the Desert Fathers, Evagrius, or Cassian, you're going to get a couple of really key insights. And one of them is that sloth is not how we should talk about Acadia. So Acadia is this deep aversion to where you are, to your state, to your brothers, to your monastery, to your way of life, to your cell, to the prayers you're supposed to be doing. And what you want is to be elsewhere. And the beautiful description of Acadia that Evagrius gives and Cassian lifts without reference, so another example of tradition that I think is grateful, but he doesn't want to be associated with the possible heresy of his teacher, is that this monk going through these thoughts of deepening aversion to these things, to eventually he hates the place he's at and he wants to be anywhere else. I'm sure we've all felt this as we've worked on papers and we start cleaning our room. And so we avoid the things that we're supposed to be doing, either by sleep, by laziness, by watching 6 more episodes of the Netflix show you're watching, so the slothful side, or we avoid it by workaholism, by activity, by kind of frenzy, just the next thing. So this is Evagrius and Cassian. Aquinas develops this a little bit more deeply, I think, by seeing this as a kind of sadness over the divine good within, a sadness over the spiritual calling on your life, whether that be friendship with God or something else. And so we want to avoid that because we don't like to feel sad. And then Rebecca DeYoung, in her book and her other work on it, but her book, Glittering Vices, really, I think, captures this in a clear way. She calls Acadia the resistance to the demands of love. So whatever the demands are in your life, whether you're a student, a parent, a kid, or whatever, there's certain demands, and Acadia is just not wanting to do the thing you're supposed to be doing. And I think part of what drives this is one of the characteristic construals or emotions of Acadia is restless boredom. And when you have this for something, things start to seem empty or hollow. They don't grab you, they don't draw you, and so you just don't like them. You don't want to be a part of them, and you want to do something else. And you can do that by just not doing them, by laziness, or you can do it by trying to find one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. So that's the kind of background, that's the view of Acadia that I'm working with. This is the way Acadia makes you see the world. You see this thing that you're supposed to be doing, this activity, or this person you're supposed to be with, or this job you're supposed to be doing as empty, hollow, not fulfilling, not interesting. And gratitude sees it in a contrary way. I'll just summarize this instead of go through the details. But in gratitude, we see a good giver giving us a good gift. And if you see this thing as good and coming from a good source, you can't also see it as empty and hollow and boring. And so if we can cultivate gratitude, which we can cultivate this way of seeing the world, which we can, then we can starve out Acadia. And as it doesn't have the food it needs, Acadia will hopefully wither. 10 seconds left, I did it. Yeah.
Nicely done. Do I have a microphone? Can you hear me? Okay. So I want to talk sort of pick up on what Rachel and Brandon talked about and sort of move to a more, what I take to be a more general level, and talk about a challenge that I think we face, all of us face, in the contemporary world, to which gratitude is an antidote, and that's the challenge of what I'm going to call nihilism. And by nihilism, it's a difficult word to define. It's sort of been explored over the last century and a half in a variety of ways. But what I mean is a couple of things. So first of all, a fundamental sense of a lack of meaning, intrinsic meaning in things. And along with that, an experience of all value, all importance as being reduced to utility value. That is, we are only interested in things insofar as they are useful for something else. So I'm interested in how, say, a particular person before me is useful for generating in me interesting experiences. My students talk about their friends in this way a lot of times. Why do you have friends? Well, because they enrich me. They give me interesting experiences. And why do you want interesting experiences? Well, that's useful for something else, maybe for advancing my career or advancing my sense of self-worth. At no point do we rest in a sense of things as having importance in themselves. Rather, everything is important for something else in this endless chain of one thing being used for another. This is a pervasive attitude that we have today. But I don't just want to focus on it as an attitude. I think it's something that's sort of simultaneously both an internal condition, it's a way we tend to view the world, and it's also a sort of external condition. Flannery O'Connor sums this up nicely in a letter she wrote to a friend in 1955. She says, if you live today, nihilism is like the air you breathe. And she goes on, you might think, well, as Christians, maybe we're immune to this. She says, no, in or out of the church, it's the air you breathe, right? So air, I think, is a good metaphor for this attitude, right? Air is something simultaneously out here, and it's something that we bring into ourselves, and that changes our interior life. Let me elaborate a little on what I mean by this. So we've talked about these attitudes about technology and about achadia. So these are interior attitudes, but they're interior attitudes that are heavily conditioned by external conditions. The technological attitude, the attitude that we want to control the world around us through technology, is something external to us. And there's something even a little bit misleading about calling it an attitude, to call it an attitude could make it sound like it's something that I've chosen to take on. But really, in a sense, it's kind of an attitude that's been imposed upon me, so to speak. It's the air we breathe. It's just the way we normally operate, right? We all have phones and computers and so forth. We live in a world that is technologically structured. And so we, in a sense, almost cannot help but think in those ways. It requires a great deal of effort to resist the utilitarian or nihilistic mindset that comes to us from these larger structures in which we live. Nihilism, I think, is an attitude or a social structure that is in many ways directly resistant to gratitude, and that gratitude provides us with an antidote too. It's an attitude that is resistant or sort of staves off gratitude insofar as thinking about things instrumentally gives me no place to rest where I can thank someone or be thankful for something, because everything is for the sake of something else. Let's take a couple examples of this sort of nihilistic attitude. We find this attitude in the way that our governments are structured, right? The bureaucratization of government, and the way in which there are these sort of self-perpetuating systems that exist to just continue procedurally doing things more or less the same way. We find it in social media, which is in many ways a sort of self-perpetuating system. The algorithms are set up to get you to keep on scrolling and liking and scrolling and liking. We find it in a wide range of social systems, which invite us to always think in this instrumental way, one thing being done for the sake of something else, without any firm place, any firm thing that we can be thankful for. Let me say a little bit then about how gratitude is an antidote to this sort of attitude which we imbibe from the world around us. And I want to introduce some ideas from two different philosophers. So one from Dietrich von Hildebrand and one from the philosopher Jean-Luc Marion. So Dietrich von Hildebrand, I think, helps us think about gratitude in a way that is particularly resistant to this nihilistic or instrumentalizing attitude. There's a way of thinking about gratitude and a way of thinking about cultivating gratitude or other virtues which actually can perpetuate this nihilistic or instrumentalizing attitude. Right? If I think, I don't want to be a nihilist, right? I want to find something stable, something of intrinsic importance that I can be thankful for. I want to find persons who have intrinsic importance to whom I can be thankful, right? And I am going to make myself grateful. Right? I am going to cultivate this in the sense that I am going to, by my own efforts, gin up this attitude of gratitude. That quite frequently can perpetuate that same nihilistic attitude. Right? I am in control. Right? I am a tool that I use to produce the results that I want. Right? I have, in effect, instrumentalized myself. Instead, von Hildebrand invites us to really inspect, how does gratitude arise? Gratitude itself arises as a gift in my heart. Right? I cannot be grateful just by making myself grateful. Right? The experience of being grateful must well up in my heart. In many ways, it's like the experience of falling in love. You can't will yourself to fall in love with someone else. Right? You receive the experience of love, right? The experience of eros in your heart as a gift. Right? It is something that, in a sense, befalls me and transforms me as a person, but that I cannot will to have. Gratitude is very much like that. I am moved to be grateful when I see the goodness of the giver and the goodness of the gift. And so very much like what Professor Stump was talking about yesterday, gratitude itself is not something that I do. It's something that is infused into me, as it were. Right? It is a grace that befalls me. And so I think opening ourselves to gratitude in that sense, allowing gratitude to arise in our heart, is an antidote to nihilism. Right? It's an antidote to nihilism, first of all, because in receiving gratitude as a gift, I am blocking this attitude or I'm allowing myself to have blocked in me this attitude of treating everything as an instrument. And then secondarily, much as Brandon was talking about how emotions are these construals of the world, gratitude is precisely that attitude or that emotion which allows me to perceive the world as gift. There's a lot of things that we can't perceive until we are moved by them. Right? Beauty is very much like this. I'm not going to really see the beauty of an artwork until it moves me. Right? Until I experience that gift in myself of being moved to admire and revere the beautiful work. Right? Only then do I see the beauty. Only when I allow myself to be moved to gratitude do I see the gift character of the world, right? The intrinsic importance that things have. And so, as it were, letting down my barriers, stepping away from these nihilistic systems like social media or bureaucracies or other sorts of social and economic systems that, as it were, impose this nihilistic and instrumentalizing attitude, only then am I going to be able to see the world as it actually is. This brings me to Jean-Luc Marion, and I wanted to introduce just a quick distinction from him that I think fully captures the distinction between the nihilistic and the gratitude-based attitude to the world. And that's a distinction he draws between what he calls the idol and the icon. To see things as an idol is to stay with mere appearances. Right? I merely look at how things appear to me. And one way in which we frequently do that is I look merely at how things are usable by me. Right? So the idolatrous gaze doesn't try to penetrate to what the thing really is, right? To its full depths, but stays with mere appearance and mere use. To see things as an icon is to penetrate past the appearances of things and see things in their depths, in their intrinsic importance. The nihilistic systems, the nihilistic attitudes that we have today, by and large, are idolatrous perceptions. Right? They only allow us to see the world as a play of mere appearances. To be moved to gratitude is to be allowed to perceive the world as an icon, as revealing depths of intrinsic importance in each thing, and then ultimately the intrinsic importance of God, who gives all things. And I'll stop there.
All right, thank you to our speakers. Before I turn it over to you all, I'll exercise my Mark prerogative. So named. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this last distinction? I like it. It's and I think I find it not only pithy but useful. I assume, of course, like the very same thing could be seen as an icon or an idol. How does one know if they are seen as an icon or idol, or how might we bring someone out of seeing something as an idol to see it as an icon? I think it's particularly hard when it's a good thing, right? It's really easy if you're like, someone says, oh, well, you like this bad thing, you should like this good thing, right? But it's more challenging if you say, well, you should like this good thing in a good way, in this iconic way, not this idolatrous way. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think it's worth reflecting a little bit, maybe a little bit more on how these sort of what I'm calling nihilistic systems lead us to see things as idols. So take technology, social media. Again, social media, not bad. Technology, not bad in and of itself. But what does it lead us to do? It leads us to stay with mere appearances, right? To not penetrate deeper, to merely look at, say, the picture on Instagram, the superficial appearance that a person has cultivated for themselves in their social media profile or whatever. And while that's not bad in and of itself, how can we help people sort of move away from this attitude? Well, providing spaces in which they can sort of step away from that for a time. Real practical example. So I teach this class on philosophy of art and beauty. And one of the things I require my students to do is spend 20 minutes outside without their phones, and then write about that. And it's extraordinary. Like, they, for a moment, have a sort of iconic vision of the world, like all of them. It doesn't take very long to realize, like, there's more to see about the world. How do we know that we're seeing it iconically? Well, you look at the sorts of things that people report. They are reporting a deeper vision of things. They are reporting a greater penetration into things, a greater awareness of their own relationship to things, in sort of halting and inchoate ways, but they're really getting it. If you can sort of step aside from these systems that block our vision, so to speak, you begin to experience this deeper vision of things, and then that's a basis to cultivate.
Thanks. I have more, but we'll talk about it later. We have some questions. I'll bring the mic around. We just have the one here. So I'll start here and then get this way, and we'll do our best. Remember to please stand up and introduce yourself also.
I'm Patricia Lenti-Crane, and Rachel, I have to tell you, I was very moved by your comments, especially about creating an avatar as opposed to a person. Years and years and years ago, because you all know I'm here from years and years and years ago, I used to give a talk to teenagers that I called the sacrament of the present moment. And I used to give it, high-tech, with a metronome behind me, and said that we get our life in seconds, not hours, not days, not weeks. And to connect this to gratitude, in my heart, I believe that if we are not aware and present in the sacrament of the present moment, can we be grateful? Is our entire person conscious of the fact that we are given this wonderful gift second by second? Because we can't comprehend it in more than a second at a time from our human nature. So glory in the seconds that we are given and learn to be grateful. People have, and I know we can only be grateful to people, so the people around us or the people that have created the event or the reason. But you brought me back many, many years, Rachel, and I want to thank you, and I am grateful to you for your session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, question here, and then we'll try to get to
Thank you to all three of you. Bill Tullius. So the thing that really struck me, especially as began with Rachel's talk, was that there seems to be a lot of overlap here between what you were talking about in terms of technology and what I think we probably all have experienced if we spend any time on social media of the superficiality of relationships people have and sort of express with each other. At the same time that this is often coupled with expressions of intense rage, vitriol, linguistic, verbal violence of a sort. And I think coupled with especially the analysis of virtue and vice that Brandon gave us and the discussion of nihilism, it reminds me quite a bit of the Heideggerian approach to technology as a sort of problematic thing as we get into the 20th century explosion of technology. Technology is in framing the world as changing the way in which we experience the world almost sort of in a permanent way. There's sort of progression and forward in time as new technologies emerge, again, changing and changing and changing the way we experience the world. And I wonder if technology is changing how we experience ourselves with one another. How does gratitude have an opening to sort of break through in order to bring us back to a sense of community, especially if we are spending more and more of our lives online. This is especially pertinent to me as I teach online. So my professional life is there. Much of my connection to friends across the country is there online. And so how do we, practically speaking, make a space in which gratitude can change how technology is sort of driving us more and more towards a sort of nihilistic and often quite hateful sort of approach to the world and life?
Yeah. You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So first thing, I guess, I think this is particularly maybe a problem in our own times, but it is an old problem. So, you look back to like Plato. Plato in the Phaedrus has this whole thing about writing and how writing alienates us from memory and speech. James Matthew mentioned this obliquely. So there's this sort of the technology of writing itself, which is a pretty fundamental, basic way of using technology, still has this alienating effect. Still has this like potentially nihilistic effect of turning language into mere instruments. So I think it's like an old problem, but it's perhaps a particular problem in our own times. Let me invoke another philosopher. Okay. Let me invoke another philosopher that I think helps like answer this question. So I think he's a personalist philosopher who I don't think has come up at all this week. Is the Czech philosopher Erzim Kohák. And Kohák was a great personalist thinker, also environmental philosopher, and he came to the United States as a refugee, and he built himself this cabin out in the woods in New Hampshire and would go out there for extended periods of time. And he has this sort of interesting read on the phenomenological method. So I think as many of you know, in the phenomenological method, we practice a sort of disciplined perception by setting aside various assumptions. So we set aside, say, causal assumptions. And causal theories, and in order to attend on what is in front of us. And Kohák had the idea that this needs to be lived out practically. And one of the ways in which it needs to be lived out practically is at least sometimes bracketing the sorts of artifacts and immersion in the sorts of systems that alienate us from direct attending to experience. And that's why he'd go out to this cabin in the woods where he had no electricity. But he would invite all of his friends from Boston. He was at Boston University. He'd invite all of his friends to come out and join him. Right? So they would have sort of community out in the woods, and they would read to one another and discuss and have campfires and stuff. And so I think it's sort of these kinds of practices which simultaneously allow us to cultivate gratitude. When you're in those kinds of spaces with your friends or with your family, and you're seeing the beauty of nature, it's really hard not to have gratitude well up in your heart. Right. At least for me. Maybe, someone who's totally jaded, I don't know. But as I see with my students who are totally jaded, 20 minutes out, standing by the river brings about this transformation. So I think it's sort of creating those spaces, cultivating those kinds of experiences, counteracts nihilism, brings about gratitude, and there's a feedback between those.
I wanted to just add one thing. I would say that, especially in the sphere of you working in technology, and that being the way that communication has to be fostered, is to truly become a personalist. And so by that I mean that when you're looking at your students, that they're no longer just names on a piece of paper, but that you do take the time to get to know them, ask them personal questions, and truly make the interior effort to care about their answers, to be able to link their personhood even through the technology, so that when you are able to hopefully be with them incarnationally, just in the same room at some point, that you're then able to continue to foster that kind of personalism that the world really longs for. I mean, this is the philosophy that the world longs for. And you see it in the way that we even approach technology, that everything is still trying to go backwards. You see digital cameras that don't have screens anymore. They were just putting that out the other day. This is the camp camera to send your kids with because there's no screen. And I'm like, what is this? This is actually a Kodak camera. That makes sense. So we're just trying to pull back, because we do see the harm that it does to the person for us not to be present with one another. So just practicing the presence of the person, even when there's technology between you, is a possibility.
Dr. Dahm, thank you for your comments. Peter Burley. I want to add maybe a bit of language that I think you'd agree with, but I'm hoping you could draw out a little bit more. The language of starving out a vice versus crowding it out. I wonder sometimes if you were to sort of declare war on academia in your heart, I like the language of starvation because it has the attitude that you are intentionally facing this and attempting to oust it. But I wonder if that, in a way, gives it too much attention because now all the frenzy and busyness that you were dealing with, you've now pointed towards this thing, and it may actually turn into a vicious cycle. Yesterday, I thought to myself, wow, Dr. Crosby's talk was very good. I will sit down and I will read the things that he's been talking about. I will have a very good experience, and it will be, yada, 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 all it hoped to be. And I realized I'm trying to force it, and there's not a kind of a gentleness or equanimity. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that in the schema that you've mentioned, crowding out in addition to starving out.
Yeah, thank you for that question about acedia. So the advice from the tradition is really varied about how to fight vice. I mean, even in a Cassian, you get like, okay, I want to know where to start. What do I do today to fight vice? And it's not clear what he would tell you. Sometimes it seems like he says everyone should start with gluttony. Gluttony is sort of the foundational vice because it's a overreaching desire for something we can't avoid. We just have to eat. And it gives rise to all the other ones. Sometimes it seems like he says, well, sometimes he does say, start with the one that threatens you the most. It's the most difficult for you. So as far as a one size fits all, here's where you should start with fighting vice, I don't think the tradition really tells us. I think there's a wisdom, and this is why we have spiritual directors and friends and wives to tell us where we should look. But as far as the different language, I guess I didn't mean to imply that this is the whole story of fighting vice, but I think it's a helpful addition. Vices are going to be crowded out largely by virtues. And thinking about virtue formation from the point of view of someone who doesn't have a lot of virtues, which is one I can inhabit pretty easily, it's nice to think about things I could do that would hurt the vice, hinder the vice, without having to force it out because temperance overtakes intemperance, or full-blown, well-formed gratitude doesn't leave room for acedia. But for those of us in the journey where we have this mixture of not fully formed vices, not fully formed virtues fighting each other, one thing we can do is practice gratitude right now, whether for the present moment or for a cool conference or seeing old friends. And if you can see those things as good right now, acedia doesn't have a foothold right now. But acedia is one of the tricky ones, like vainglory, where fighting it can become a list of things that you use to check off the list, and now you have this list of things that you can do to avoid the things you really should be doing, like maybe spending time with your family, instead of thinking, okay, I'm not actually looking at my daughter or talking to her because I care about her and see her as a person, but because I'm going to win versus acedia or something like that. So I don't know. The vices are tricky, and we have to be. I mean, this is what Cassian's doing. He's giving us a battle plan. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, I'll just note, we do still have a fair amount of time, so I will try to get to a lot of the questions. I see a lot of hands raised. We'll try to keep the questions succinct, though, so that we can get to as many of them as we can.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. I had a question about technology. It seems like technology actually gives rise to new ontological space for new art forms to exist. Take, for instance, cinematography and a lot of the stuff Bishop Barron is doing for Word on Fire, too, seems to bear a lot of fruit. And I was wondering if there was a development actually not just in forms of art, but also human interaction that could actually be like a positive development in terms of how we could relate to each other. And then I had a question for Dr. Dahm. In terms of gratitude and acedia, I was wondering, where does ambivalence fit in on that?
So I think that one of the gifts of technology is actually something that you also see within the gifts of the literary fields, that the poetry that we shared in this morning, we've all shared into it in at different times. But then we were able to share in it today in this room. Just like you'll run into someone maybe in the airport that's from another place and they're reading a book you just read, that there is now communion because you've both experienced the same thing. And so technology does provide that, especially within those evangelical spheres of evangelism and culture. You're going to see people that are from different walks of life and different experiences that are now able to find communion because of the gift that technology is. And so with the rise of communication through technology, we do have the opportunity for communion. But like I said, it has to be for the convenience of communication. But our true aim is to then take the screen away and to share an actual communion with one another. So I do think it does provide a new ontological space, but it is not the premier ontological space for being.
Andrew, correct me if I'm not understanding your question well, but I think Acadia can manifest as ambivalence, where like you're indifferent, you don't care, you're not committing to this or that. But if you think of like, I don't know, Kierkegaard's aesthete or something who wants to be indifferent, wants to not commit, it's clear he's avoiding something that he has an aversion to. And so I think that's probably what's usually in the background, that there's something that there's a clear call or some sort of felt, here's what I should be doing. And the ambivalence is a kind of coping mechanism to avoid that.
One more thing also about the technology point. So I think, again, this is an old problem. Technology can block us off, even very primitive, quote unquote, primitive forms of technology can block us off. But I think one thing, they can also, help us achieve new forms of communion with one another. All the potentially nihilistic technologies I mentioned really are good things in many ways. I mean, government bureaucracy can help a large nation like ours function better and provide goods and services to more people. And, the economic system, which can be so alienating, can also bring capital where it needs to go and provide people with work and so forth. And I totally agree that, the technologies like cinematography and so forth are wonderful new art forms. But I think we have to be sort of creative about how to bring gratitude into those spaces. So one thing that I think helps is actually focusing in on the technologies themselves. So take cinematography, for example. There's the possibility of cinema becoming alienating. There's the famous essay, probably many of you know, by Walter Benjamin, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he basically thinks cinema has just totally alienated us from actors and from art, and it's just unmitigatedly nihilistic and bad. And I think that's false, but we can come to see that it's false by sort of focusing in on the craft of cinematography and coming to be grateful for that craft and attending to how it can be done well. Or we can think about economic systems and the ways in which they do foster communion and bring people together. So sort of attending to those structures just as we might attend to nature, rather than allowing the technology to be a screen between us and the world, sort of shutting us off from things and their intrinsic importance. I think that can go a long ways to counteracting these nihilistic effects.
The other thing I'd say, too, as you're standing to introduce yourself, I stand slowly. The beauty, too, of technology and like things like cinematography is that they do also obey tradition. And so there is an act in gratitude, and even just using the technology to then give whatever you're giving to the world in a more widely way. I mean, you see it in Abolition of Man that you say the thing that you're trying to hate, you're actually passing it on, and you're actually obeying the tradition by even taking the thing that you used to draw on pieces of paper, and now you're able to draw it using the technological resources that we have now. So it's still an act of gratitude, and it's being able to move from the language that Mark used, but moving from the idol to the icon, even within that space. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brother Bruno. I'm a Benedictine from New Jersey. I have a question about acedia, but it's really for the whole panel. In the early monastic tradition, acedia is treated as the characteristic affliction of the hermit. And as eremitic life gives way to cenobitic life, you hear about acedia less and less, to the point where John Climacus, writing much later than Evagrius and Cassian, talks about how acedia is the constant companion of the hermit, but that community life is opposed to acedia. And going along with that, there's this traditional understanding of acedia as this aversion, or like the odium professionis. Perhaps it would be helpful also to think about it as an oblivium professionis, or when one loses sight of the ends of monastic life as the purpose of monastic life, then acedia follows very quickly afterwards. But my question is about this dynamic between community and acedia, because it definitely seems like it comes through in the monastic tradition that there's something about living in community, there's something about the cenobium, but I think it's applicable to us in the modern day. What's this interplay between community and acedia, and how does community form a bulwark against this affliction?
So I think, like other vices, community can both be something that heals, something that fights the vice, but it can also be something that amplifies or gives occasion for the vice. So think of anger. I think it's I can't remember I don't have the reference at hand, but the story is that one of the brothers goes out to be a hermit because he doesn't want to struggle with anger anymore, and he starts getting mad at his pencil when it doesn't do his things that he thinks it should. And so the community can help, but also these are all interior things. And so the community, like for the person suffering from Acadia, the monk in Cassian and Evagrius' classic description, the brothers are part of the problem in the way Acadia is making him think. They're not the right brothers for him. They're not the brothers that help him become holy. They're not doing the things they should. They're not living the way they should. They don't appreciate him. And because of the way Acadia or lust or vainglory make you see the world, the community you're in, or the lack of community you're in, can become part of the problem just as easily as part of the solution. And so I think it changes the situation, but I wouldn't consider it a sort of straightforward solution. And I don't think that we see, Acadia's central to Gregory and Aquinas' accounts as well, and Cassian was living in community. Even a lot of the early Desert Fathers were in early communities, and it was a serious problem there too.
No, I think it's a great idea to look for these enemies of gratitude, these opposites, and to think about overcoming them. And there's one enemy that I haven't heard yet, and I'd really like to hear you all on, and that is this sense of entitlement, this sense of grievance, this sense that I've been offended, I'm owed restitution. Yeah.
I really want to hear your question.
All right. So that certainly is antithetical to gratitude as anything could be. That sense of angry entitlement and constant grievance. So I'd be interested in your take on that antithesis to gratitude and on the antidote to it.
I have a quick comment on it. So when Roberts goes through, I can't remember if this was included in the reading packet or not. I think I may have had to cut it off before this. But when Roberts goes through failures of gratitude, one of the characters he gives is someone who thinks everything is due to him. And so then, the gift is lost. And so I think that's one straightforward way. And so to cultivate recognizing, the humility would be part of this, recognizing what you're actually due or not, and see gifts for what they are would be one clear way to start.
There's a political theorist at Berkeley, Wendy Brown, and she has a recent book on nihilism, and she sees this sense of entitlement as kind of a prime symptom of our nihilistic times. So she talks about how in a sort of nihilistic system where everything is seen as just an instrument or a tool for something else, right? We come to see ourselves as that way, right? I'm like the old metaphor of I'm a cog in the economic machine, right? I'm just sort of a part of this larger machine. And then I have to sort of carve out a space for myself. I'm just sort of in the rat race day after day being used to advance these economic purposes, and I got to carve out a space for myself, and so we have this sort of hedonism that arises. And I'm going to at least have some enjoyment during my free time, right? And so I'm going to live hedonistically then. The rest of the time I'm a tool in these larger machines, but in my free time, really, I'm just sort of an instrument for my own pleasure. And what arises out of this, she thinks, is this sense of entitlement, right? I'm being used all the time, but I'm going to get what's mine. And gratitude is sort of an antidote to all of these aspects of the problem, right? If I can cut through the instrumentalizing utilitarian view of the world and come to see the importance of things in themselves, that's the importance of myself, the importance of other persons, that's going to move me to be grateful, and that's going to be an antidote to this sense of grasping things for myself.
You're good. Go ahead.
Hi, Daniel Stepke. So one of the things I notice when you talk about boredom and acedia is that often people fall into acedia because, and the reason why they find this boredom with things is because they don't think they're skilled enough or capable enough to get into things, and so they kind of look across reality and all the things that they could be doing, and they just kind of say like, well, look, I'm not skilled at any of this. I'm not good at any of this. There's nothing I can enjoy or occupy myself with because I'm not going to be good at it. Do you think there are either do you think there are ways that either gratitude sort of pushes against that motive for acedia, or practices that that help those sorts of people?
I guess I feel this way about philosophy most days. And so part of the gratitude is like, I've been given this great chance, this opportunity to try and do it a little bit better, even though I'm not going to do it very well. And that's motivating. It makes me think about Aquinas' sort of dual virtues of magnanimity and humility, where humility is to not seek things too high for us, but magnanimity is to have the proper ambition to challenge ourselves and think things and pursue the things that we can do with God's help. And if you see these things as things you can only do with God's help and as gifts, I think that could help a lot. But maybe that was my...
I like to use the language of like living in a tension. And so you have to kind of will to want to suffer that, which is, I think that's what he meant by philosophy. But you have to will to want to suffer in that way. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have the ability to do this, but I know that I've been given a kind of gift to do this. I will suffer and will myself to do this experience, to exercise this good, and then see what comes of it. I think that I was really, like I was telling you guys yesterday, I was really convicted by what Dr. Stumpf was saying, because it's a moral obligation to go for glory. And so it is a moral obligation for you to try, And so I think that it's part of suffering as well, that sometimes we have to suffer the good.
I think this is a case of that idol-icon distinction that Marion draws. So the sort of idolatrous approach is the approach that I see myself just as an instrument for other effects, sort of this horizontal view of the world. And so I'm going to become discouraged because, I'm not good at very many things. And all I am is an instrument to bring about various effects. So I'm sort of a bad instrument, a bad tool. As opposed to the iconic view, if I can see myself as an icon, right? Like what I am is a revelation of these depths of reality, and ultimately a revelation of God. And I'm going to be less concerned about like what I can do at that mere appearance idolatrous level.
Alex Spielender, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you guys could expand. There seems to be a bit of a tension between this idea of gratitude as a vice or as a virtue, being a emotion generating, I don't remember the exact word, but something that generates proper concern-based construals. Between that and what Mark said, that you can't just like make yourself grateful. You can't just like go out and decide to be grateful for everything. And there does seem to be a tension there insofar as like I think you could probably correct yourself when you realize that you're more upset about the broken vase on your reputation than your endangered child. So if you could just elaborate on that, I'd be really interested.
I'm going to start Mark off. I wonder if maybe talking about developing your art example where you have to be sort of moved, but then you also can practice the things that help you appreciate it?
That's right. Yeah. So I can't make myself feel grateful any more than I can just directly in the moment make myself admire the work of art in a sort of deeply felt way. But I can put myself in contexts where those feelings are more likely to arise. So I can, for example, decide to step away from technology for a while, right? Spend time with friends, go out, spend time in nature, or attend to the craft of the technology that I'm working with. Those are things that I can will myself to do. And if I will myself and to put myself in those sorts of situations, more likely than not, gratitude will start to arise. And then I can do what von Hildebrand calls sanctioning that. I can say, yes, I want this feeling to arise and to continue and to allow me to construe the world in the right way. And that's going to encourage that feeling to arise more. So it's a sort of indirect cultivation of the feeling, even though I can't directly cause it.
Yeah, and then maybe another distinction, Alex, would help is that I think you can practice pretty directly seeing a thing in a certain way. So I could practice seeing this opportunity as a gift. Like I think you do this with art. You can see how someone might appreciate it even if you don't.
Yep.
That doesn't mean you have the right concerns generating that way of seeing it, or it doesn't mean you actually do appreciate it, but it is a start in that direction, and it will help you not see it as ugly or boring or something like that.
And one other thing, you can spend time around people who already do these sorts of things well. So like spending time around already grateful people and first making the decision not to be cynical about it, which is a decision I always have to make. But spending time around grateful people and sort of letting their gratitude rub off on you, so to speak, is also a way of cultivating those feelings.
Thank you. My name is Matthew Brooks. Rachel, I was particularly struck by observation that the vulnerability of another person in a face-to-face encounter demands reverence for that person. I wondered if any of you had any thoughts on a connection. Seems to me there's a connection between reverence and gratitude. And
So just to go back to the last question and some of their responses, and then to tie it to yours, to give you a very trivial example of this, I hated soccer growing up. I know that you're like, why are you telling me this? But let me go further. I remember being in high school and sitting with a friend of mine, him trying to explain soccer to me, and I said, this is dumb and I don't care. And so now later, and actually getting up and leaving the soccer match, it's like, I don't care very much, I'm gonna go. So now later on, I have married this wonderful man who loves soccer very much, and both of our sons are very, very good at it. And so out of love for them, I have now grown to understand and love soccer. And so it's the same, I am the loudest soccer mom in the world, by the way. And so that goes back to the understanding that when you're with other people that show gratitude to something that makes you uncomfortable, because of your gratitude for the person, you then grow in gratitude for the thing or for the object. And so there is a certain reverence when you practice gratitude, the interpersonalism that you experience there. But then when you're with someone and the vulnerability that is also involved in reverence, there is no chance that you cannot practice reverence without gratitude. They are linked arm in arm, that you are going to practice being reverent for this object, for this person, when you practice gratitude for it.
Okay, we have one last question.
Awesome. Thank you. Rob Reed, Baylor University. So I would like to ask a question that kind of brings the conversation we had about gratitude today as an acquired virtue with the presentation we had yesterday emphasizing it as an infused virtue. So maybe Brandon could start. But could you just say generally what sort of the advantages, disadvantages are in taking an acquired virtue approach versus an infused virtue approach?
I have opinions on this that are not opinions the speaker yesterday agrees with, I don't think. So I actually think practically, largely, it's not that different. So Aquinas thinks that the infused virtues are given, of course. They can't be earned, they're gifts. but they don't come fully grown where they eliminate the struggle to do virtuous things the way if you have a fully formed acquired virtue does, on his view or Aristotle's view. And so even if you have, whichever view you have, thinking about these as acquired or infused, the start is different, right? But how you actually go about growing them is very similar. It requires practice. Although if you have an infused virtue approach, the causal story is going to be different, and you're going to be doing things like praying for them and practicing the sacraments to grow them. But as far as the other kinds of activities, they're going to be, I think, pretty similar, is my view. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I have a sort of weird idiosyncratic view about some of these virtues. And it sort of is inspired by Hildebrand. So Hildebrand has this idea that there are these properties that certain things have which render them important in themselves, right? What he calls values, right? So like beauty and justice and things like this. And when we are rightly disposed or rightly open to them, they move us to have feelings and attitudes and perform acts that we would not otherwise perform. So what I think we have here is sort of a hybrid of acquired and infused, right? The values, as it were, infuse these virtues into us. When I encounter something as a gift, it infuses gratitude into me. I have to then sanction that and cultivate that. But even on sort of the natural level, there's a kind of infusion from the world that happens there.
I want to use a little bit of Susanna, Mark's wife, wrote an essay in With All Her Mind, and she talked about the virtues. So I want to use still a little bit of her language that she used there, which was that virtue building is like muscles. You know, my children think it's hilarious to come in and they go, "Mom, I have no muscles." And the truth is that they do. They just have not been fed. They have not been broken down to be built again. And so that's something that has to happen. I think that's part of the suffering of virtues, that you're going to have to suffer in order to build them well.
Thank you to all of our panelists, to all of you for your questions.